going to hand over now to Andrew Black from the University of Sydney. He's the director of the Westmead Living Lab, having been formerly the Director of Research Development and Collaboration. He's on the board of Intersect Australia. He's a member of the Science and Technology Australia's Policy Advisory Committee and on the Research Advisory Committee for Local Government New South Wales. Andrew has a PhD in chemistry, and in 2015 he completed an executive MBA. And Andrew, I'll leave it to you to disclose any previous career as a rock singer.
No previous career as a rock singer. Can you see that screen now? Yeah, I'm just feeling inadequate after that presentation, actually. That was excellent. So lots of, I'm also a keen cyclist in Sydney, so I can relate to the bike path thing. And there are a few, so I find this whole bit about control and resilience really interesting too. One of the things that turns out that had frustrated me for years and years and years, which I only now realise is a design feature of these things at Sydney, is there's a particular spot in Newtown where a bunch of roads and bike paths converge from a whole bunch of different directions at a traffic light where some things get lights, some things don't. There's zero signposting, and you get there and you think, what is going on? I don't know which lights I'm waiting for. I don't know what's happening. There are cars, people, bikes, and it turns out that's intentional so that everybody just stops and pays a lot of attention to what's actually happening in the intersection. So I find there are really interesting things that you can do to, make people more aware of a situation or get them to engage with what's going on rather than just be riding blasely through with their headphones on and what have you, right? So it is kind of fascinating. But having ridden on the roads for most of my life, I'm very comfortable. So I can relate to the people being afraid or uncertain and the value of that. Anyway, I mean, I could talk to you. I do want to talk to you more about some of those things anyway. So really what I wanted to do today is, and I'll cover perhaps a few of the things that we've already talked about in the previous discussions, but the experience that Martin and I have had trying to start a living lab at Westmead. One of those challenges, let me just give you a picture, I hope, of what the space looks like. And sorry, this is a bit grainy, but this is the sort of Westmead Health Precinct, and this is in the heart of Western Sydney. So this is the Parramatta CBD down here. So you've got this big sweep of Parramatta CBD around the back of the park through to where the hospital is. And in some ways they're kind of disconnected, but there's a bunch of development planned and slated for the next 10 to 20 years, which is potentially another campus for Sydney Uni, development of some heritage buildings, and there's a startup hub that's getting built. There's a light rail that, as we speak, is tearing down this road in front of the hospital and will go all the way around. Ultimately, there'll be this new metro train station from Sydney CBD that comes through Parramatta and Westmead. So there's a whole bunch of stuff happening, but at the moment it's a very, very interesting and slightly disconnected ecosystem. And one of the bits of history is that the University of Sydney's been there for a while and not as well connected as we'd like to be. And in a bit of current strategy, there was an intent that the university be more engaged, and someone had the idea that we'd set up a living lab there without really talking to any of these multiple partners that are clearly in the precinct. So we've kind of been battling from the get-go to engage all of those other stakeholders because we're kind of a minor player actually in there, where it's all about health and you've got hospitals and big buildings going up and all this sort of stuff. It's not quite clear where you come in as a university trying to do something in a collaborative way with a bunch of other people. So just a bit more context then about how you start to read the health system and where there might be opportunity. We talked about, we'll talk a little bit more about scale of problem, but if you think about, care as being delivered in community and general practice all the way through to hospitals, and that's obviously what we face at Westmead. You've got those situations, you've got a kind of population level of health issues and all of the various pathways that go back and forth between all of that. There's lots of interesting space to go and find problems. And so that's good, but then that's also challenging as well about, where do you find things that are interesting? Where do you find the kind of people that you'd want to work with, etc. And I should say I'm going to talk in general at a very high level, and Martin will talk much more specifically about particular things that we're doing and some of the criteria we have for addressing some of these challenges. So anyway, it's messy and complicated, but you can start to see how the kind of approach that brings lots of stakeholders together and community and users, people who have to experience the health system, could start to make a really useful contribution. There's plenty of other stuff that's changing as well, and other challenges that are obviously facing health, medical research, and this is all a bit from the kind of university health sector lens, but you can see again sort of fertile ground for the kinds of problem space that you're interested in. And COVID as well has thrown up a bunch of things that make it clear that we need solutions to lots of important problems that aren't really being tackled, or they're being tackled in a kind of ongoing business as usual way. So again, opportunity, but not so straightforward. So if you want to do this from a university perspective, and I think there's a whole interesting conversation about who leads in these processes, right? So in some ways, I think Nathaniel and James, you're in a great place because you're leading and owning, and you kind of got all the levers in your hands, and it's almost, you've got to go the other way to bring stakeholders into a process that you can do. I think Martin and I often feel like we're trying to prize our way into this big ecosystem and show that we can add some value. So some other challenges from the university side are, it's a different way of doing things from most of what happens in the university. And we see this in all sorts of ways, right? So universities mostly tend to be a bit more at the pure end of things and discovering new knowledge, which is obviously important, but less at that translational and practical end. We had a conversation earlier about acknowledging expertise of other kinds than just that sort of very traditional academic expertise. People in universities, I think, also like to think that they own and are the creators and builders of ideas. So acknowledging that ideas and innovation can come from other places is a challenge, and there are particular KPIs in universities as well, right? Measured on grants and papers and these sorts of things, and not so much actually whether the thing that you have an idea about or create or can start to build actually has some impact in the world. And I think then all of that leads to some challenging conversations in the university as well. We talked a little bit about scale, again, because it's a locally oriented activity. How do you scale things that can sustain in time and space? There's an interesting piece of capacity building that we're working on as well, which is a sort of shared language. How do you translate between people who work in universities or who work at the council or who work at company X or in the healthcare system itself, for example? So this idea of being able to understand your own way of describing the world and being able to listen to and understand the way other people describe the world is a really interesting concept and one that's important. And this is a particular challenge for me, which is getting on and being pragmatic about the things that you want to do rather than idealistic. And I found when I started in this role that was a challenge for me. Having been indoctrinated into the Gareth and Phil view of living labs as a very pure quadruple helixed activity, to understand then that it's actually not so straightforward, and kind of any progress is actually good progress if these are the goals that you want. So then, there's a kind of boring view of what a living lab might do. And, we kind of wrote this down about what we would do at Westmead, and it's got all the right buzzwords and the usual kinds of things in there. And then what we have started to do are some projects now and some things that we've been working on over the last couple of years. And this is the kind of last slide, and I'll just touch on a few of these things. And like I said, Martin will pick up some of the more specific things that aren't described here. But there are a bunch of things that we're kind of directly involved in, or that are starting to feed into a bit of an ecosystem of projects that fit in this mould in Western Sydney. So this was a really interesting piece of work that we did over the course of last year. So there's this kind of nano health initiative going, and we took this co-design approach to understanding how to prioritize for new technologies that might address COVID and sensing in different kinds of ways. And we had a range of co-design activities with people who'd had COVID, people who worked in healthcare, industry, university, etc. And we went through this process of prioritizing some things, and then that gave us some different outcomes to what you'd get if you just had a bunch of academics in a room. And we kind of wrote that up as a method, and that got published. But that was a really interesting piece of work where, again, you get people together and share those insights, and academics hearing from people who've had COVID, who have a very different view of what matters, have an interesting experience with that. This project here is one that the Westmead Applied Research Centre got funded from Google. So this is an AI grant where they're using trying to apply AI to some text messaging systems they've got in engaging with community around delivering reminders and alerts for self-care around cardiovascular disease and people at risk of cardiovascular issues. And so there's a bunch of co-design and engagement that goes on with that. Now, it's not quite in the co-design from scratch, but how do you start to bring the expectations of community, consumers, patients into the way that you deliver care and apply interesting technology as well is a real challenge. This grant here we got just at the end of last year, and this is a bit left field, but it does play a little bit into the space that we're talking about. So this is a citizen science grant we got from the Department of Education, and there's a kind of co-design heart here as well, where you want to work with teachers and students to come up with new ideas for citizen science projects that you can engage people in, that will give people a better, more engaged experience of learning science, and hopefully have positive outcomes as well for those people in the community. So that's another example. This one here, which is perhaps most relevant to you guys at Newcastle in particular, but we've got some researchers at Sydney particularly interested in heat. We're in a conversation with Parramatta Council about heat and air quality and the impacts of these things on health, and trying to, we're in a conversation about coming up with a project that we can start to do that brings citizens of Western Sydney into what would matter to them, what would be useful to them, how can we bring the technology piece, some research, the things that the council cares about as well. So that's a really nice opportunity space that we're exploring there. And this other kind of research activity that we're working on at Westmead is a sort of learning health system, where you start to get a much more real-time flow of data that can inform how care gets delivered. And part of that is building models that bring in the outcomes that consumers want. So lots of what goes on in health is driven by what doctors want or the system wants, but how do you get a shared set of outcomes built particularly on what the patients and consumers want, that can start to drive the way that care gets delivered? How do you build a model that builds in data in real time? So these are just some of the things that we're starting to do, and it's a bit all over the place. Nothing really fits perfectly into that living lab lens, but I feel like we can start to make some progress, and that's all to the good. So it's difficult, but we're moving along slowly. So I'll stop there. I think I'm way at the end of my time.
No, you're doing great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Andrew. Really wonderful to hear more about what you've been doing. So actually, we don't have a lot of time, do we? But we can take a couple of questions. Who's got a question for Andrew?
Excellent.
Oh, no, you don't get off that lightly.
No. Yeah, answer questions, that's fine.
no, Andrew, I guess as you were talking, one of the things that I was wondering about is, I think for university-based labs, we feel our context often is a really big constraint on the work that we do. I'm wondering for you, what would be the strengths of being based in a university? Why would it be, and why would it be important for a university to do this kind of work, do you think? Especially given that a lot of universities are making the decision to sort of implement living labs at a strategic, it's a strategic level kind of decision, as opposed to often a ground up one. Like what are the particularities of the university environment that are great about, great to work with?
Yeah, it's funny, and that's a really interesting point about universities wanting to do it. And I fear that there's still a little bit of a lack of sincerity in universities' desires to do that, right? That it is a strategic thing. People, senior leaders in university, think there's value in being seen to be driving impact, translating, and it's not always the case that you have many people in the institution or the capacity in the institution to do that. But the flip side and the positive, and the thing that you're looking for in the question is, I think inherently there are actually a lot of people that kind of sprinkled around the university who really care deeply about being engaged with the world and doing things that are useful and valuable. And they have a whole bunch of expertise in different ways, right? So I think if the lab from a university perspective can harness that desire and knowledge and expertise and the resources, even though they can be, sort of the usual grant writing processes, for example, but it is possible to get resources through a university that are kind of new money into a system through grants. Those things can be applied then to problems with partners and for partners, right? And so I think there's a balance to be struck between university says it's a good idea, therefore we'll do it, and the individual passions of people who will do it in the right way, right? Who will do it with the right outcomes in mind and because they want to collaborate. So that's what it's at.
And have you found that that you've got some examples under your belt now where your way of doing things has proved to be contagious to others inside the university?
Yeah, so those examples are, they're absolutely ones that fall into that category. So they're people that have said, I really want to do something with the Living Lab, even though the Living Lab barely exists and it's not clear what it is, right? They come and they say, Martin will give some examples as well. We want to do stuff with you. We really like the construct and the model. And, that heat work is a great example where, we're talking now about putting grants in together and all those kinds of things where people want to work in this way. So yeah, it's quite exciting actually.
That's so fantastic, and reminds me that we've got a really strong heat research group at Western Sydney that we need to connect with those people.
Yeah,
yeah, fantastic. Okay.